Um, Hello. I think that when I address the audience, it's just like, that's my greeting. Um, that's the name of my audience too. Maybe, maybe not. Why do I disparage myself? Why do I disparage myself today? I don't know. There comes a high time when you stop disparaging yourself, and the time that you stop doing that is when you need to be forthright with the message that you're saying. Today's message is about multiplicity, and let me talk to you about multiplicity. Multiplicity, I feel like getting right into it. That's what I feel like doing. I'm going to tell you right about it, and there's nothing wrong with going right into multiplicity. Is well, look at that bottom number in a fraction, that denominator. The denominator as opposed to the numerator. The denominator, when the denominator is 7, this is a different 7 than when the 7 is in the numerator. I've spoken about this before, but like the 7 in the numerator it's really a it comes down to that it's a differentiated 7 when it's in the numerator, as in it is 7 different. It speaks to 7 separated instances, but they like the 7 in the denominator. The 7 in the denominator is a collective of a 7. It's a collective 7 because you measure it that way. When you take the fraction 3 out of 7, this is a fractional amount of 7, same as 4 out of 7. This is a fractional amount of 7. But if you went to you consider 22 over 7, this is 3 whole 7s and then a fractional 7 left over, a 1 out of 7 left over. But it's measuring things in terms of a collective 7 or a whole 7. So the denominator, 7 as a denominator is 7 as a collective as opposed to a separated 7. But it's like 7 in the denominator is a sameness 7 as opposed to a different, where it's 7 different counted instances in the numerator. And so the denominator 7 is a collective or a group, or really like an identity 7, because an identity is a sameness. The opposite of an identity is something like a difference, but that you would say that the numerator, that doesn't matter. I'm just saying that the bottom 7 is a collective, but it's a similar thing to say that it's a complex. But I'm just saying that the denominator is like a product, as opposed to an additive instance. A numerator is a value. The denominator is like a product because of its place as a collective. But if you look at the word complex, and let me find the word complex here. Complex, etymology. A denominator is like a complex. So the word complex from a 1650s definition is that a complex means composed of interconnected parts formed by a combination of simple things or elements. Complicated, complex, intricate. So it's composed of interconnected parts. It's from a Latin meaning surrounding, encompassing. So that is kind of like something that has authority would be surrounding or encompassing, something that has territory. And that's what a collective or a group is, something that has you're considering the within of an authority as opposed to you count the whole authority as an object. So I'm saying that's the 7 that is named in the denominator is really the within of the subjectivity of a 7. But the 7 itself is like an entity that has a name that you would be like, oh, this is the object 7, this is the subject 7. But past particle to encircle, and this is all. Here we go. There's a multiplicity, and we got multi-layer. It's multi-layered multiplicity. So that when you talk about a 7, it's just that you might. When you talk about a 7, it's a certain multiplicity. There's a multiplicity 7. This is 7 in the denominator. It's basically as a multiplicity instead of as something that's added. But as a multiplicity is basically a product because you're talking about the multi-layered nature of it. When the multi-layered nature or the multiplicity is called a 7, this is a 7 that has 7 layers within one thing. The same way that multiplying, like multiply toilet paper, is a 2-in-1 strands of toilet paper that you are trying to refer to as one single piece of toilet paper, but you're like, oh, it's multiplied, but you look at it as one sheet of toilet paper. That's why on toilet paper packaging, they're like, oh, 48 equals 24, which really it doesn't, because 48 equals 48, 24 equals 24, but like 48 equals 24, they're just trying to communicate a multiplying that happened. Two, it's same as 6 times 7 is 2 components that results in the product of 42. A single name as multiplied of, 42 is a multiply of a 6 and a 7 specifically, but all of these multiplies have different names. Every multiply has a different name, but a 42 as a multiply is different from a 42 separated counted instances. But multiplying is multi-layers. But it's like, but if you consider a 7 as a whole, because if I look up the word, let me get back to complex in a second. If I look up the word multiplicity, and I'm going to look it up with a lot of poise and patience right now, and that is how you do things. Multiplicity definition. A large variety, not a very specific definition. I don't think Google's much in the business of teaching you anything, because a multiplicity, you see that I can talk about multiplicity and the definition of it for a while. They think, oh, let's keep it as simple and as vague as possible. This is the point of defining something, I'm sure. Yeah, a definition isn't your opportunity to make something, to explain it specifically or anything like that. Like, that's not the point of having a definition, of having a point of reference. It's not a point to explain anything specific about, because I'm saying ironically that a definition is obviously where you make it most specific. What does Google come up with for the word multiplicity to explain the very specific nature of this one idea that we wanted to communicate to ourselves in society? But a large number. A large number. Oh, a large number is the first definition that they give for noun multiplicity. A large number. So what? It's 391 billion? Is that what a multiplicity is? Oh, a large number. Okay, very specific. Thanks for telling me what a multiplicity is. I really learned a lot. You definitely want to help me know what that term is, Google, I'm sure. But I get out of order. I get out of sorts. I get bent out of shape. I feel the difficulty weighing on me of trying to speak, trying to have a more open world where we communicate things better or something like that. But it says a large number, a large variety. I swear to God, I looked up this definition a couple months ago and it was more complicated than that. I think that they're taking time to dumb shit down so that nobody learns shit. But you know what? That's why Google is probably just going to be replaced, is because they're not taking the time. Their search engine is not good anymore. You have to really put in the specific thing, but in some areas. But anyway, what we got in terms of a multiplicity, here we go, multiplicity. But the example sentence that they use is good for a multiplicity. It says, the rainforest and the multiplicity of species that they harbor. The multiplicity of species that a rainforest harbors. And so in that example sentence, the rainforest is the whole and contains a multiplicity, contains a multi-layering of all these different species. And it is a collection of all the species that the combination of all the species, that it fulfills the entire spectrum of the rainforest. This constitutes the whole that is the rainforest. But it's like multiplicity is like taking the term and then considering everything that it's composed of. So it is like a time, or like a spectrum where all of the categories fulfill the whole, the same way that I was talking about in the time, the previous episode, is that so multiplicity is like a product, is like a time, but it's like you can consider with the multiplicity the more specific layering of things. But like you could consider the multiplicity of the rainforest. The rainforest is but like, no, that's not a really great example, because the multiplicity of the rainforest is like, if you were to consider that is the collection of all rainforests. But the way that the term rainforest is used as an example of all rainforests, but you look at the within of rainforest is what the term multiplicity does for you. You look at the within, the collection of all instances of it, like everything that is, there's a multiplicity of rainforests, and constituting the multiplicity is every example of a rainforest. But So if you were to look at the word species, the multiplicity of the word species is every single species. The multiplicity of a cow is every single instance of a cow, really, because it's like the multi-layering that is named that. Yeah. Yeah, the multiplicity, but that's what they're saying with the example sentence. That's what they mean to say, is that if it's a multiplicity of, except that they used the rainforest and the multiplicity of species. So they're saying the multiplicity of species, but they mean the multiplicity for species, the collection of all things that are called species. But you understand how all of those are collected into the rainforest. Like the rainforest is a way of sort of defining all the different species, but it's talking about all the species specifically that are in a rainforest. That isn't all the species that exist. So it's talking about specifically this whole about different species that exist specifically in the category of a rainforest. But we're talking about multiplicity. Multiplicity is like a multi-layering, but you understand that a spectrum is like a multiplicity. So every considerable instance in a spectrum is the multiplicity of like the title of the spectrum, so to speak. But because it's a product, because when you consider all the different frequencies in a spectrum and then how they collect to make one title, such as the frequencies within the microwave spectrum, if you consider all of those frequencies, how they collect to make the whole microwaves, this is the multiplicity of microwaves because they're all combined into this one product. But it's a product because you sectioned it off and titled it something, and now you're able to sell it. So it's kind of like you're able to sell it, and by that I mean it has the potential to become popular and be theory that catches on for a whole society, the same way that Einstein's theory of relativity, what a great product. But his product is a multiplicity of all of these time and space and relativistic terms and ideas. And it's a product at the end of the day. It's a product, but a multiplicity is a product, but it's kind of brings to you the idea of considering that the 7 in the denominator is a product because it is exemplary of the collective, the 7 as a collective, because you're like 22 over 7, this is 21 over 7, this is 3 whole 7s, 22 over 7 is 3 wholes of the 7, but like 7 in the denominator is like the unit that is relative to other units, and the other units that it's relative to are like 5 in the denominator, 6 in the denominator, because these are all different units because they're all wholes, they're all ones. Unit is a word for a 1, but different versions of 1 in terms of numbers is you would explain that through the numbers being in the denominator, because that's where they are ones. That's where they are wholes, is when they're in the denominator. When it's 7 in the numerator, this is not a 1, this is a 7. But like 7 as a 1, because a 7 is a unit, whether you like it or not, because you can go 7 feet per second, you can go 8 feet per second. But like you call 7 feet per second a different name than 8 feet per second, and what you have are different units. But you could do that just with feet. You could call an 8-foot instance Clementine, and then you call a 9-foot instance Zuckerberg, and then you can relate 8 foot. So an 8-foot length is called a Clementine, and a 9-foot length is a Zuckerberg. But it's like these are the units that we could have used instead of foot or inch, really, because it's arbitrary that we arrived at inch, because it's like. But like inch is based on even less than a meter is, but a lot of the things that they base the speed of light off of the definition of a meter, and then in turn base the definition of the meter on the speed of light, just to really hammer home the uselessness of creating arbitrary units. But I mean, just so that they can make a name for themselves. No, I don't know. But that's the product. Nobody's trying to make a name for themselves. Obviously, we need these units as points of reference so that we can measure things. But we sell them as certain kinds of products, and the product is a multiplicity. But it's like the selection of components that comprise the product is the multiplicity. Is the multi-layering of it. But so there are multi-layers in a multiplicity that but like there's a way of dividing 54 into 3 categories that in this case they all have different names, a 2, 3, and a 9, but you could also understand that it's divided into 54 different ones, but like that's implied by any single numbers any single number spectrum. But I'm just saying you can consider a number to be a spectrum if you're considering its existence as a whole. Its existence as a whole is like in the denominator, as opposed to in the numerator. But so like a multiplicity is like a multiplicity is basically the same thing as a multiplex. It actually comes from the word multiplex, but whether or not this is related or not, I'll run this by you. Multiplicity is a lot like the word multiplication, but you see how that C is both forget this example because it's dumb. So multiplicity comes from the Latin multiplex, but basically plex as a suffix is interchangeable with plicity. So a multiplicity is essentially a multiplex. And a multiplicity is essentially a complex, but a complex is different from a multiplex or a multiplicity. So like you wouldn't say complicity. I don't know that that's a word, so I'm just going to ignore that. A multiplicity is like a complex or a multiplex, but a multiplex means a plex that it consists of more than one unit or component that makes up the complex, because a complex has to be a product of two or more components. And actually it can be a product of one component, but I'll get into that in a minute. But it's like a complex is differentiated from a multiplex because a complex also allows itself to consider the single unit complex, but multiplex is not a definition for the single unit complex because multi has to be more than one. And so a multiplex is a more than one plex. A complex is also pretty much every more. So a multiplex allows for a twoplex, a threeplex, so like a duplex or a triplex. These are all, now a duplex is specifically a twoplex, and then a threeplex is a triplex. But a multiplex allows for twoplexes, threeplexes, fourplexes, fiveplexes, whatever. And on all the way up, as long as it's two or more. But a complex allows for this whole set of things too. So a complex is basically a multiplex, except that complexes are a more general term for any kind of plex, and also it would allow for the single unit complex. The single unit complex is called a simplex, which is a perfect name for it because the simplex is the very end of the parameters of complex's ability to dictate authority over this plex idea, because in a simplex is the very far reaches of what complex is able to have authority over or be relative to, and it is also the opposite of something complex is something that is simple. But they came up with the word simple as simplex to describe the single unit complex. And it's so like a single unit complex is difficult to understand how this is differentiated from a unit itself. But like the number one, in the number one is like is a sameness or an equality is created out of both the numerator and the denominator, but it's like 1 over 1 is the same thing as 1 over 1, where you're considering the 1 in the numerator and 1 in the denominator. But a 1 over 1, if you were to emphasize or point an arrow at the 1 in the denominator to say that you're trying to explain the definition related to the 1 in the denominator, it would be you're talking about the idea of a simplex, or a single unit complex. But a simplex is the opposite. Something that's simple is the opposite of something that is complex, and what you have with the simplex is the opposite of the within the range of possible complexes. A simplex is one of them, but just barely, but only because it is like the defining parameter at one extreme end, but is also the opposite of the defining parameter of complex. What complex has authority over at the other extreme end, what complex has authority over is the thing that is the most complex at the other extreme end. So it's like complexity to simplexity is the order of the spectrum for complexes. And so it's like simplex you see is a single unit complex, but like so just consider the 1 over 1, and this is something like an imaginary number, but it really just gets to the heart of that 1 is able to speak to everything because it is the same thing. 1 is the same thing really, both as a numerator and a denominator, but no other number really gets to say that. Like 2 becomes 1/2 when it gets put in the denominator, but that a number can be expressed as the numerator and the denominator. What you want to understand is the link between how 2 is relative to both 2, the value, and 2 as 1/2, because 1/2 is just this version of 2, but might even speak to half of what 2's real existence is. But so multiplicities are like multi-larings are like a multiplexes. A multiplex is the same thing as a multiplicity, but they're like a complex the same way that the denominator is a product or is because a complex is a product. If you go into the grocery store, here's the thing. And here's the thing is that, so I'm saying that a spectrum is like a multi-layering of every single considerable instance, but it's combined into one product. But that you put parameters on the spectrum is you made it a product instead of that it gets to exist as something that's disintegrated, infinite, and goes forward objectively speaking. But like objectively, or objectivity is a word for a tendency towards further and further out from yourself is basically what objectivity means. And so like further and further out towards boundarylessness, because objectivity speaks to like a direction basically away from a boundary that you're considering. So that like if you're considering the world objectively from your perspective and the way that you look out at all of it, if you don't categorize it, so that if you're like if you're in the country of Morocco, let's use a more relatable even. If you're in the country of Germany, then you can, and you're in Germany, you can be like, oh, my objectivity extends to Germany, and you can make the categorization that way. But like objectivity itself is not defined by Germany. Obviously, it's going to keep what is objective extends all the way to the rest of the universe. But the objectivity of your perspective is like a tendency towards further and further out, or like a tendency towards uncontainedness, but like boundarylessness from where you start as a boundary, but like you can put it within any boundary. But if you're really considering the full extent of objectivity, it goes further and further out. But like the full extent of subjectivity is that it is contained. Like subjectivity is always contained. It's like subjectivity is a tendency towards containedness, but like that is less a tendency because it's just something that you're already, so like let me see. You're like you go to the grocery store, right? Do you go to the grocery store, right? Don't you? Do you go to the grocery store? So you go to the grocery store. The grocery store is a complex. The grocery store itself is a product. Kroger has many different grocery stores. The grocery store itself is a product because this is a more collective way of describing the way that they make money off of their products. But like they've integrated all of these different products, and grocery stores, like what exactly is going on inside of them is also something that I wanted to say. Let's stop for a brief minute. And let's see if I can change gears here, because it's just that grocery stores, I feel uncomfortable when I'm in them. But the reason I feel uncomfortable when I'm in them is because they are a detriment to society, because they're evil. And what I mean by that is that you have to be doing something at every minute that you're in a grocery store. Now, I'm not advocating for hanging out in a grocery store, but it's like, you couldn't possibly hang out in a grocery store. You couldn't just stop for a minute and be like, hey, this is the most impatient place in the world. You have to be doing something at every point in time. So the second you're entering a grocery store, you're just on this task list. Like you have to do this task. Everybody is task doing. Nobody is waiting. Nobody is allowing anything to happen, because you have to be doing something. You have to be looking for food. You have to be getting a food at every moment that you're in a grocery store. It stresses me out every time, but it's like, what are we doing with these grocery stores? Or examine your life once you're in a grocery store. Like, what the fuck is going on in those places? It really paints a bleak picture of life, because it's like, I end up in the grocery store and you get all the food is organized for you in this way. And you're like, go to the grocery store, but a grocery store is like stepping into a time capsule. 30, like Pop-Tarts for 35 years in a row. That's what I'm talking about. But like the time capsule museum nature of a grocery store is such that how the hell are they selling Pop-Tarts they're selling Pop-Tarts every single year. They're in the Pop-Tart aisle. there peanut butter is in the peanut butter aisle. Like this is a way of organizing peanut butter, but it's like we made it so that peanut butter is organized at every single stage of us knowing about it. It's organized. It's put in a peanut butter package that is called peanut butter. Like this is not the way that peanut butter by itself exists. It doesn't exist. Like it exists more naturally. I mean, maybe it's not natural because you have to like do something to create it, but like oregano or something or turmeric, you put it in a oregano package and then you buy the oregano. And then when you bring it back to your house, it goes on the shelf where the oregano goes. So it's always organized when like nature isn't actually organized, but everything. But I mean, I'm talking about like social constructs, obviously, but the social construct of the grocery store is, it's baffling. It's baffling when you consider, Pop-Tarts again this year. And Pop-Tarts, not just this year in this supermarket locally by you, but in every single supermarket across the entire country, there's Pop-Tarts for 35 years in a row. Like, how come how come they stopped wanting different things? Like we got to a point, like the markets capitalized on exactly everything that Americans wanted to the point that we don't put anything new in there. And every grocery store is just becoming a time capsule. And because they're all the same, like the same aisles, it's the same products in the same plate. You know what you're going to get. It's always the same looking in the grocery store. It's been that way forever. Like we got to a point with the cereal market where they cornered every single cereal that we could possibly want. They collectively came up with the cap for like the market cap. They collectively constituted the market cap's worth of like however much money could possibly be in the cereal industry. They cornered every section of that market and then reflected it back as these specific, necessary, pinpointed instances of cereal where it's like now forever, because Americans stopped wanting things at some point. We got tired of wanting new things, or I mean, we weren't creative enough that we could overcome what the market came up with to meet our needs in terms of cereal. We weren't creative enough, and then they're like, oh, so every cereal aisle is Apple Jacks, Frosted Mini Wheats, Raisin Bran, Fruity Pebbles. Like there's a lot of them, but like this is as far as we got. Like they got us, they figured us out. The cereal aisle is now the same. It is these cereals, and it is difficult. But the entire thing is a giant product. The cereal aisle itself is a product. Just Apple Jacks is a product. Like one Apple Jack is a complex, is a product, is a multiplicity. Like one Apple Jack is a multiplicity. The ingredients that go into one, because any Apple Jacks box, it's like, oh, all of these ingredients, all of these vitamins in Apple Jacks, but you understand that those are also in any one Apple Jack. And then one Apple Jack is a complex, is a product, a multiplicity of all these different ingredients. But that's how you name it. You name it the Apple Jack because the Apple Jack is only named that because it is composite specifically of these ingredients that make an Apple Jack what it is, because the authority on Apple Jacks, the Apple Jacks people or whatever it is, Post or something, they determine the definition of Apple Jack is composite of these ingredients. So it's like a complex of multiplicity, but then the whole box is a further complex at a more general layer of categorization. And then cereal aisle is composite as a product, but the whole grocery store is a product, is a complex, is a multiplicity, but it's a Kroger store, any one Kroger store is a multiplicity of Kroger, things that you can buy there. But these constitute the definite, like what makes a Kroger. So it's like a Kroger is composed of all these ingredients the same way that one Apple Jack is composed of the ingredients of vitamin A, vitamin D, riboflavin, thiamine. I mean, I just wanted to be impressive, but I only got so far. Zinc, probably zinc, probably iron, probably potassium, probably but you understand the nature of complexes, you understand the nature of multi-layered instances, and so it's like I'm saying that a 7 in the denominator it's like a multi-layering of 7 things. But so a multiplicity and a multiplex, These are all complexes, but complexes speak to the within of something, the way that something is composed. And so this is the difference between numerator and denominator. Denominator speaks to the subjectivity, the within the composition of something, of a 7. But a disintegrated 7 in 7 separate instances. But like this is an identity, it's a multiplicity. Yeah, maybe I don't need to speak for more than 30 minutes about it. Maybe that's all that I needed. But let me look up the definition for multiplicity so I can talk a bit more about it. Or no, okay, so it's like the idea of a multiplicity, a 6 times a 7 equals 42. This is like a coincidence. A 42 is a coincidence of a 6 and a 7. So if you're speaking of the idea of coincidence, you speak of the idea of coincidence, you do, if you want. Speak of the idea of coincidence. This speaks to a 6 times a 7 as opposed to a 6 times a 7 times a 3 that creates a single instance, because a coincidence is a single instance created as a result of 2 instances. So that if you're like a seagull, you saw a flock of seagulls flying from shore, and then so you're like, oh, there's going to be a storm coming, and then there is. Or let's just say a storm comes after you see a bunch of seagulls come in from the shore, and you're like, oh, there might be a storm coming, and then a storm comes after that. But you might be like, that's not necessarily true that you saw those seagulls flying from shore and then a storm came. The flock of seagulls and the storm are a coincidence, but like this is the coincidence, is the activity of a flock of seagulls and the activity of a storm. And it's like, you talk about a coincidence where you're saying like, oh, don't be superstitious about it. There's no correlation. It doesn't mean anything, because the two things, the flock of seagulls and the storm, if you're like, oh, that's a coincidence, if you've proved that scientifically there's no such thing as seagulls showing you that there's about to be a storm or something, then these two things would be incident on each other, but they create the incidence, but it's a coincidence. So it's like a coincidence is really just a coinciding of events, that you like find a penny on the ground and then later you have a good day or something. Like these are two incidents. I'm saying that a coincidence kind of has to deal with two activities, but like if a basketball hits the rim, a basketball hitting the rim, it's a break, it bounces off. This is a basketball being incident on the rim, but you often use the word incident on to describe particles. Like an electron was incident on a wall or something, or like radiation. Particles of radiation are incident on you as they enter your body or something, as they hit you. But like radiation is incident on the world deflects it through its electromagnetic sphere or something. And so there's two things that are incident on each other, but in this case, the flock of seagulls and the storm are two activities. They are incident. They create a coincidence. But if it's a coincidence, you're speaking to that both of them co-created the event, like co-creators. Co-creators, it speaks to that the two people that created it, they're both responsible for half of the creation. So it's the same with a coexistence, like half and half. But and that's what you're saying to describe it as a coincidence, is that they were both half and half. One didn't they weren't related. So then it's like correlation means that the flock of seagulls was 80% responsible for the thing or something. I don't know. It's difficult to describe the incidence that results from the coinciding of two incident events. But I'm saying the flock of seagulls is incident on the time that you're talking about, or like the result. And then the storm is like the flock of seagulls is incident on the storm is incident on the flock of seagulls, but neither are incident on each other in a way that overbalances the two. This is some symbiotic thing is going on. But like you describing something as a coincidence is you're saying that it was random, basically. You're saying that it was random rather than that. Because both things had full like weight, or they weren't affected by each other, so that it was random that the two things coincided. And so like when two things are incident on each other, this is kind of like a 6 is incident on a 7. A 7 is incident on a 6 to create a coincidence of a 42. But it's like a coincidence that two incidences happen. Incidents happen. So that's a lot of the word incident in a short period of time. I bet you didn't anticipate this. Let me look up complex etymology one more time. Because like I only need to do 40 minutes on a multiplicity topic, obviously a complex, but why I want to say that a denominator is a like a name of something, but it says a denaming, but a denaming is like a deposing or it's like a deposing, a dename or a deriving. It's a derivation of the original, so it pollutes whatever the original was. So it's like whatever the original, like a deposing or a de-designation is like a separate is like a signation derivative of the original signation, like a designation. But you have a signal or a signation. That's a difficult thing to pin down. I don't even know what that means. So I'll use a different example. Like a deposition, a deposing is a watering down of the title or status or authority of what originally existed that you get deposed. But it's a lowering of status the same way like a descension as opposed to ascension. A descension is a lowering, but like a DE prefix is not always a lowering because it's like like a DE is kind of more like a lowering, but a DI is just the explanation of a 2. But like a DI for a diameter is more talking about that there are 2 points that you have to link with a diameter, a DI, because it's a really vague term for saying that there's an existence of 2 things, but your designation, at the point that there's a designation, this is also, you're talking about the existence of a second thing, because the second thing that exists is the derivation of the original. But it's like, in this case, when it's a DE or it's like a deposing, this is a second instance that's created vertically, either lower or higher, kind of more so than like a DI. A DI is more a vague, like, oh, there's a second thing. But I'm just saying, you understand with a deposition, this is a lowering of status. But I guess maybe more specifically lowering than creating a status that's higher. But there is a higher status in comparison to the lower status that's created. But like in a deposing. So a deposing creates there's at least one more. Same with like a definition. There's at least one more that are designated finiteness, a designated name. But like if you're with a denominator, it's like a denaming, as opposed to like, don't get too caught up in the whatever complicated thing I was just saying about the DE. Like a denominator speaks to a polluting of the original name. It's like a name. And it's really like a plex, as the word complex is described or as it's defined. Plex, to weave with together, to weave, braid, twine. Complex, something like complex definition. It's like a group of related elements, but the part of it is a CON. It's CON, but because it's a P follows it, they change the N to an M. So the complex is basically a CON prefix, and a CON prefix means with. And so what you have with this word, it means with plex, but with the word complex, it means with plex, but plex means parts, interconnected parts or elements. So the plex speaks to the amount, or like the plex actually just speaks to the name, is what I'm saying. The plex speaks to the name or the parts, but then the prefix tells you how many. So if it's duplex, it's 2 parts. So the plex part is the parts part of it. Because the definition is interconnected parts. The plex speaks to the parts. Simplicity speaks to the parts, and then your prefix tells you how many. Multiplicity tells you 2 or more. So a triplex is 3 parts, but I'm saying with the word denominator, you want to see this as the same thing as complex, basically, because the denominator part of it is the name or the part. Like, as long as you're as long as you're speaking in terms of units. Is if you're with me that this is more the denominator is for expressing a number as a unit or as a collective, then you understand that different names as different plexes, like a 7 as a complex. This is like, I mean, it's just like it's a 2 as a complex is like a duplex, basically, is what I'm saying. But because 2 is the name, it just kind of. But I'm trying to link complex to denominator. Nominator is the name, is the plex part of it, but it's just talking about connected parts. Connected parts are the. But when you have different names in the denominator, like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 14, 31, the 31 is like is a D name. But so I have to say that D is the same thing as with name. But like a denominator is just a name that's been it's something is done with the name. I'm trying to work this out here. Something is done because you have the name originally, the numerator, but the numerator is the number. Numerator is the number. Maybe this is just the difference between number and name. The denominator speaks to a name. The numerator speaks to a number, because the numerator is a number, is something that's counted. The denominator is a name, but it's like a designated name. It's like a definition, basically. Yeah. No, it's basically a definition, because a finiteness is a definition, but a given finiteness is a different definition. But so like a designated finiteness or a definition this is the same thing. Like a finiteness is a name, is a plex, but like that is a definition in comparison to other definitions, speaks to that is composed of different things in comparison to other things' compositions. So different plexes for different, like a definition is a definition, and then consider the within of it. But like a number, kind of, as long as it's a numerator, it's speaking to the number version, and then that speaks to a different thing than the name. Really. So, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it's like, I already know that the 7 in the denominator is the 7 as a collective or as a sameness, instead of the 7 in the numerator is a 7 as differentiated. But really, I think what you want to say is that the numerator, since it is a numerator, is for the number. But this is the difference between numerator and denominator, is the difference between a number and a name, if there was one, but there is one. And it's like the name, as long as you're speaking to the name, you're speaking to the title of it. You're speaking to the product that's created, the collective of a whole. But like multiplicity, divisibility, another thing that you'd want to consider about 1 over 7 versus 1 over 6 versus 1 over 9 is that fucking 1 over 7 is like a term for a percent out of infinity, because 1 out of every 7 number, if you marked a point at every 7th number up to infinity, you counted by 7s up to infinity. This is like an expression of 1/7 in terms of infinity, because every 7th number that you hit, because on the way up to infinity, approximately what you'd arrive at infinity is 1/7 of the numbers. If you're saying count by 7s up to infinity and consider the collective of up to infinity, like 1 out of every 7 numbers were accounted for. And so the expression 1/7 is like a percent out of infinity, in the same way that, like I've described, one is like an infinity. And so like a 1/7 is like every 7th number up to infinity also accounts for the percent 1/7. And so it's like a number at infinity, or like 1/7 is like a rate instead of it's like a velocity instead of a position. It's like a rate, because the way that 7/7 itself up to infinity is expressed in the term 1/7, but 1/7 then is like the rate or the velocity version of 7 in the numerator, 7 as a position. And like it's because it's 1/7 7ing itself up to infinity is a constant process, but it's like a frequenting process. But frequenting process is a velocity, the way that 7 frequents itself up to infinity. But like the act of 7 frequenting itself is expressed in the 1/7, because it's the same thing as the percent out of infinity that you'd find as like the total of the rate of like where you'd be able to mark every 7. But I'm talking about multiplicities. Yeah. talking about multiplicities, I was 7 is like a rate as opposed, it's like a velocity as opposed to position. It's like a particle, but like the top one is like a part, but top one is like a particle, is like a wave. But maybe it's just if you consider what something is composed of, this is more like spoken of the way that it exists as a wave instead of just it as a point, but it as a point. Yeah, I mean, it would be easy to not understand what I was talking about. But long story short, multiplicities are like products or like complexes. They're like they're like multiplicities. Let me see if I can go a little bit longer about, but I probably could. It's just that the multi-layering of within a spectrum, the multiplicity, but like the multiplicity of species speaks to every species that you could come up with that fulfills the definition of it. And so the denominator of 7. So I'm basically saying that like a multiplicity of 7 is but it's kind of like if you had a 7, I'm trying to figure out how you might describe a spectrum between the numbers 6 and 7, and how this maybe is something you'd want to call a 42. Like, and I probably was describing this at some point, but like if you put 6 at one extreme of a spectrum and 7 at the other extreme, because this is like saying in a world where 6 and 7 are opposites of each other, and because they're not, but like, I guess I'm of the idea that it's kind of dependent on language, and language is arbitrary. Like you could create language for where 6 and 7 are opposites, like because there's a scenario where this is possible. But like based on the agency of opposition, that like it's kind of difficult to pin down the two things are opposite. But like if you made 6 and 7 opposite, maybe there's language for this idea the same way. Like it's waiting on the language to be created, but it's like expressing things in terms of spectrums is the pursuit of putting two things as opposites that aren't apparently opposites. So like I want to describe the idea of like 6 is one end of one parameter definer of a spectrum. 7 is the other parameter. This makes them opposites, even though in reality they aren't. And then you would call this spectrum 42 because their multiplication is 42. But it's kind of like saying that a 6 as a multiplicity considers everything that is a 6, really. And I know I'm saying a number of things about the multiplicity of 6. The multiplicity of 6. Like, I'm saying it's a group of 6 elements, yet I'm also saying it is everything that could be a 6. So it's like, it's infinitely something because there's infinite things that could be a 6. But maybe that's a better definition. And maybe you should just separate like a 6 as a collective as a denominator from the idea. Because like a multiplicity of 6 considers everything that a 6 could be, but this is like the spectrum of 6 considers every infinite possible instance of 6. But if you multiplied 6 with 7, and then you understand that the direction left to right in a spectrum is the inverse of the direction right to left in the spectrum. So it's like a 0. It's kind of like in one direction you consider 0 to 1 of the spectrum, the other direction you consider 1 to 0. But these are 0 and 1 are two variables within the spectrum. Now make 0 and 1 6 and 7. In this case, all of the elements that are 6, the multiplicity of 6, everything that can be a 6 is interwoven with all of the elements of 7, the multiplicity of 7, everything that can be a 7. And you get the connecting of these two multiplicities because they're like the multiplicity of 6 is like the multi-layering consideration of everything that is a 6. But like multiplication is a deep enough idea is maybe why it's so like complicated. We haven't like come up with a translation to say like this is where multiplication ends and where addition begins. Like multiplication is a deep enough idea. Maybe it's multiplicity takes into account the idea of 6 as a collective of 6 times. And then also everything that a 6 can be. But like, yeah, because it's like a group of 6 could be a group of 6 anything. It's kind of like so it's a complex idea, but it's like a multiplicity is like a complex. 6 is So like everything that could be a 6 is the multi-layering constituting of everything that is a 6. But like that layering becomes coincident on the multi-layering of 7 in a spectrum between 6 and 7. And then you might call that a 42, but it's like 42 as a product is like a name, is where you want to consider 42 to be a name. But if you consider it in terms of that, numbers themselves as products instead of as sums, numbers as products are just names that are essentially composite of other names. So that like 21 is a name for 3 combined with 7, but it's more efficient because 3 and 7, that's a 2-name system, but 21 is this efficient name. So like what you arrive at is this different layer of identifiability, different layer of categorization. That is the same thing as a 3 combined with 7, but it's like the name is a more efficient point of reference. And so prime numbers do something where they are like the set of efficient points of reference, like efficient names. But like in reality, it's kind of like they're the things that are always components and they're never. But like when they are a whole, nothing makes them what they are, but they're like eternally components and the only thing that are a whole just by themselves, but they're important. I'm just saying it's impossible to figure it out. That's why nobody knows the pattern of prime numbers, but the discussion of prime numbers is strongly related to this discussion where you're trying to understand that numbers as products are just efficient names, but it is like efficiency that you're describing with prime numbers. Prime numbers most efficiently create all other numbers. And so there's some efficiency that you arrive at possibly if you understand the way that numbers are efficiently named. But it's like in terms of the infiniteness of it, that would be worthless to try to figure out. You would have to describe the prime numbers in a different way. But it's like the set of prime numbers are the comprehension of. They are comprehensively all other numbers. They are the comprehension of numbers, but like numbers comprehended, that you comprehend something intelligently. But this is what prime numbers are more intelligent than the rest of numbers, that they are like the progenitors. Well, but would you say that the older generations are more intelligent? I mean, or are they less? But it's like they're prime numbers, they're archetypes, they begin things. They're really like less intelligent because they're less diversified. Because out of the comprehension, out of the prime numbers, which are all essential, you get more numbers, you get more specified. But the prime numbers are the prime examples, the original existences, out of which come diversification, all of the rest of numbers. And so, but the set of prime numbers is like the most efficient set of numbers because all the other numbers can be created off of it. But because all the prime numbers are related to 1, it's kind of like 1 is the comprehension of all prime numbers. Like 1 is the ultimate prime that begets all of the prime numbers. The prime numbers beget all the rest of numbers. And so 1 is the prime, obviously, but of course it would be because it's like in it is every single other number, but 1 is everything. 1 is all these, has properties to be whatever. And, that was a rushed, I'm just energetic. That was a rushed explanation. I hope you got your money's worth. You're not going to hear more of a hit piece on multiplicity anywhere else. Suck it, multiplicity. I bet you thought you could run from us, but now we know who you are because we don't have to look at the Google definition and read that you are a large number. That is not right. A multiplicity, but learn things. Yep. Thanks for listening though. And another episode will soon be coming out. Bye. Talk to you all later.